Welcome to the S.O.A.P Bible Study Series from Oak Tree Community Church in South Bend, Indiana. We're working our way through the book of Jeremiah. We're almost halfway there.
Yeah.
We're in the fifth week into it.
Right.
And we've found some pretty interesting things so far, both in prophecy and historical narrative.
Yeah, exactly.
And some verses that people tend to remember but don't know where they're from.
Right. So last week, the big news was there's a drought. Mm-hmm. And God says, look, this is one of the ways I'm going to get rid of some people. And he says there's going to be war, there's going to be famine, there's going to be droughts and plagues.
Yeah, and maybe even multiple droughts, right? Like
yeah.
Plural, like, right. Ongoing or a series of droughts
right.
even.
And God again says, look, you guys need to change. And he knows that they're not going to.
And they know they're not going to. That's sort of the problem.
They're all playing the game there. Yeah. And then we also went through a bunch of things about Jeremiah last week.
Yeah.
God told him some specific things that he should not be doing. Don't marry. Mm-hmm. Don't have any children. Don't go to funeral dinners. And basically don't go to parties.
Yeah.
Too. And all those don't make sense when you're living a normal life. But when you're living a life where he was, they make sense.
Yeah.
Right? Bad things are going to happen. Let's prepare for them beforehand.
Yeah. Well, it's very logical. And, there's nothing to celebrate.
Right.
So no parties and funerals. We're expecting them. And I mean, there's a reason that they're happening. So it's not like, oh, this is so sad. Stop rejecting God.
Right. But from a human standpoint, Jeremiah has actually given up a lot.
Yeah.
I mean, as a person.
Yeah.
Now, he gave it up for God.
Yeah.
Right. And he gets it. But he's also lamenting on, guys, my life is God.
Yeah.
Here's everything I've given up.
Well, and in this week's reading, in chapter 20, he's actually going to push back a little bit against God on this very topic. It's really interesting.
Kind of setting up
for
that. Yeah. So we end with Jeremiah visiting a potter and God going through and finally ending up with, can I do what I want? Can't I do what I want to with the clay?
Yeah.
Meaning with us, can't God make us into what he wants to make us into?
It's true. But the flip side of that is that the clay sometimes is not willing to be worked with.
Right.
And so the potter says, well, fine, I guess I'll do this instead.
I'll do my plan B.
Yeah.
Right. And that was our big takeaway from last week. So this week we actually continue with the pottery trend.
Yeah.
Which is kind of cool.
Yeah.
So God tells Jeremiah, hey, take a pot and go talk to these people.
Yeah.
So Jeremiah does that, and he's talking to the priests, and he's talking to some high-level people, and he says, look, this disaster is coming because all of you have rejected God.
Yeah.
And then you've offered sacrifices to idols, even down to, look, you guys have killed kids.
Child sacrifice.
Yeah.
And God flat out says, this is something I've never told them to do. I've never asked them to do it. I don't want them to do it. And yet they're doing it in my name.
Right.
Like, this is completely opposite.
Right. So where Jeremiah was, he tells them this here is going to be known as the Valley of Slaughter.
Yeah.
That's not a good. Nothing good is going to happen here.
Yeah.
And then Jeremiah broke the jar in front of the people, and basically said, "This is how God's going to break you."
Yeah. Yeah. Just like I smashed the jar, God's going to smash you, your city, your temple, the whole deal. Right.
Right. So everything's perfect now, right? So we get into chapter 20, and of course there's repercussions, and you would expect there to be. Now, God told Jeremiah what to say, and he faithfully said it to the people, but the message was bad, and the people can't get to God, so they're blaming Jeremiah.
They'll shoot the messenger, but they do.
Yep, so they take him, they flog him, and they throw him in jail. And there's a whole section where Jeremiah is talking to the chief of security there, and he basically goes through what God said, and he let this guy know that, dude, you're going to see all your friends die.
Yeah.
I mean, this is going to happen. The people of Judah are going to be handed over to the king of Babylon, and they're going to go into exile. All the plunder, everything we have is going to them. I mean, there's There will not be any treasure left, and you yourself are going to die in Babylon.
Yep.
I mean, there's some pretty hard stuff here.
Well, but let's not miss the prophetic aspect.
Yep.
I mean, if this doesn't come true, it proves that Jeremiah is not from God and that these
Right.
other guys are telling the truth.
Right.
If it does come true, then everybody else is a liar and Jeremiah is the only one holding the true message.
Of course, they're all dead.
Well, small,
Just a little.
small detail.
Yeah.
But this is, like you said, he gets flogged, he gets thrown into prison, this whole
flogged.
thing, right? Like, he's beaten.
Right.
And so he starts to have a little bit of a pity party, which is completely understandable.
Right.
Okay. But here in chapter 20, he has a prayer from verse 7 all the way through the end. And it's really interesting because it reminds me a lot of the Psalms. It starts with Jeremiah complaining. You talked me into this. You made me a prophet. I didn't want to be a prophet.
Right.
And at the end, why, sort of like Job, why did I not die at birth? Why did, this
right.
But right in the middle, sing to the Lord. Praise the Lord, for he rescues the oppressed from the clutches of the evildoers. Curse the day I was born. Praise the Lord. So a little bit
But I think everybody's been there, right? And it's, yeah. I mean, you laugh when you see somebody else going through it, but when we go through it,
yeah.
You're right there in the middle of it.
Yeah.
Right.
He says, so you gave me this message. I don't want to share it. So I try to lock it up, but then it burns me from the inside out. I cannot help but share
it out.
Now, I've heard people use this one verse to explain, I have this burning message from the Lord for you. I just can't wait to preach this to you. Like, that's not what Jeremiah was. That's exactly the opposite of what Jeremiah was saying. Don't use this verse about how awesome this message is going to be, because Jeremiah didn't want to do it.
Every now and then you hear a pastor, hey, I was gonna have a message on this. I was there, I was done. And then, I got this burning need in this message that we have to go in this direction. So we're going in this direction today.
And there's
some
validity to that, right? And some legitimacy there. But if he's quoting from this one, I've got this fire burning in my belly, I gotta preach. Like, okay, I think you misunderstand what Jeremiah is talking about here.
Yeah.
But there's this other thing where some people, you go back to chapter 1, God says, I knew you before you were born, from your mother's womb, the whole thing. And some people take that to mean, God chooses people from before their birth and all this other stuff. And they use Jeremiah as the example for that. But again, Jeremiah is like, you made me be a prophet. I wouldn't have done this if you didn't make me. I really hate this. So you sort of push back with, because some of the same systems and people say, they quote the potter and the clay. What does the potter have to, or what does the clay, can the clay argue against the potter? Sounds like he's arguing apparently against.
So is it wrong? Is it wrong for us to argue with God?
I don't think it's wrong, because I think it's the attitude.
Yep.
Right? I really do think it's the heart thing. And he's going through a lot of stuff and he's venting to God. But where does he end up? Curse the day. Okay, yes, curse the day I was born. But he also ends up sing to the Lord, praise the Lord, much like David does throughout the Psalms. And I think that's the attitude that Psalm 103 says that God knows that we are dust. He knows what we're made of. He knows that we're these frail little dirt bags down here. So we stomp and scream and vent. And then God says, are you done? Yeah, I'm done. Okay,
no, thank you.
Now let's move forward.
Exactly.
And I think that's the key.
Yeah. Okay, so chapter 21, we finally get a time indication. So we've been going through here for 20-some chapters, thinking we're going through in chronological order, and sometimes realizing, whoa, he jumps. Jump back, he's jumping forward, and jumping around. So I think we learned that King Hezekiah, right, was king in this chapter.
Zedekiah.
Oh, Zedekiah.
Yeah,
Well,
Zedekiah.
no H. Zedekiah. Which means we're close to the end, right?
Very much, yeah.
Yeah, right at the end. So Babylon has attacked a couple times by now.
Yep.
And we may not know which attack we're with, because sometimes it's really hard to understand. Okay, which was this the first attack? Was this the second attack?
Yeah.
Third attack's kind of easy because everybody's gone.
Yeah,
by
right.
that point.
Yeah. Well, and Zedekiah, when Zedekiah was king, it was after the second attack, before the third one.
Okay.
It was Zedekiah who,
Because they put him in power.
yeah, Nebuchadnezzar set him up in power, and then finally said, "You're done."
Right. Okay. All right. So King Zedekiah asked Jeremiah for God's intervention and help, which is kind of odd, right? Because the king of Babylon put him in place, and now he's saying, "Hey, help me with this guy who put me in place."
Well, what's interesting is that Zedekiah ends up rebelling against Nebuchadnezzar.
They stop paying taxes.
Yeah,
to him, right.
which is what instigates the third attack, where Nebuchadnezzar finally takes him out altogether, takes out Jerusalem and the temple. So what we're seeing here in chapter 21 is sort of the precursor to that third.
Yeah, I got an idea.
attack.
Let's ask God for help. And Jeremiah says, God says no.
Yeah, it's a little too late, man.
Yeah. And then he says the people have a choice, and then they have two choices. They can stay in Jerusalem and die, or they can go to Babylon and live.
Yeah.
And then of course you're in a land that you know nothing about.
That it's interesting that verse 8, two courses of action, two paths, one life, one death. That is not the first time this has shown up in the Old Testament. Back in Deuteronomy 28, Moses said the same thing to that second generation of Israelites out of Egypt. I'm setting before you life and death. Are you going to obey God or are you not going to obey God? At the end of Joshua's life, in Joshua 24, he says, I'm setting before you life and death. You choose who you are going to serve. You're going to serve the God of the nations, or you're going to serve the God of Israel.
As for me and my family,
we're going to serve the Lord. Right. Yeah. Even Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, he says there's two ways. There's one way that's broad, there's one way that's narrow. So this concept of two paths, life and death, is thoroughly permeates Jewish literature, the prophets, and everything. This is not new. They've heard it before.
Right.
And so Jeremiah is actually sort of invoking Moses almost when he says this. One thing I wanted to point out, and that is the dude's name in verse 1, Pashur. Zedekiah sent Pashur, the son of Malachi, etc. The same name shows up in chapter 20 as the guy who is the security chief who beats Jeremiah. Right. Two different guys. Right. Two different guys, same name, two different guys. So just as we're reading through it, it's not.
Well, that close, you would expect it to be the same.
Yeah, it's not. Right. And we know that because this guy actually, we're told who his father is. He's the son of, and this is the position he is in. He's not the same guy. Yeah.
Okay. Good. Okay, so we get into chapter 22, and I'm going to tell you right now, chapter 22 is a little bit of a misdirection, and you're going to forget about it when you're reading, but it is a little odd. It talks about the king. Mm-hmm. Doesn't name the king.
Nope.
And then halfway through, 3/4 of the way through, it tells us who the king is, and we realize we're 20 years in the past now.
Yeah, from chapter 21.
Yeah.
20 years earlier than Zedekiah, right?
Yeah.
But it sounds like...
Well, I think that's the exact point, right? Because it's the same thing. God's saying, guys, you need to stop what you're doing or bad things are going to happen.
Yep.
So I take it to be is God letting us know he's been telling us the same message forever.
Yeah.
And telling those guys the same message forever, and they're not getting it. There's ample chances, ample opportunities to change, and they've chosen not to.
Yep. I think verse 21 is really the key to this chapter because it fits exactly with your point. Yeah. God's been saying this for decades, centuries, really. Back to Moses. Verse 21: While you were feeling secure, I gave you warning. But you said, I refuse to listen to you. This is the way you've acted from your earliest history onward. Indeed, you have never paid attention to me. That's sort of God's summary
Yeah.
of the whole
Yeah.
situation.
So as bad as it sounds, we can kind of say that today too, right?
No question. No,
Right. When
but it's
things
easy
are
to laugh
great,
at.
why we need God,
Yeah.
right? We don't. And then the first time, it rains, God,
Right.
why is this evil falling on me?
Yep. Yep. What's interesting, though, is that was the message from 20 years ago. So even 20 years ago, they had never listened to him. Right. And now Jeremiah is saying the same thing to,
Right. Okay, so in the same chapter, starting in verse 24, we now move ahead, right? And it tells us, right? So now we're with Kim's son, and I think I say that right because the ending of one of the king's names ends with Kim.
Yeah.
Jehoiakim.
This is the date that tells us that we're 20 years earlier than the previous chapter, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Nebuchadnezzar had attacked for a second time.
Yep.
And in verse 30, God says that this king was wicked enough that God says none of your children will rule. So is that the end of a dynasty there then?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So Jehoiakim was taken into captivity, and he ended up dying there. But it's a really interesting story in Second Chronicles, rather. He actually sort of gained favor with the king, and he actually got to eat with the king and everything. So it wasn't. I mean, it was bad, but it wasn't as bad as it could be.
Right.
His son Jeconiah, God puts a curse on him that says, write down as if he never had children. Well, if he's the son of the king, that means that you're right. His dynasty, there is none. Because officially, legally, he has no children, even if he did have some. Now, what's interesting is this. That means none of Jeconiah's children could be king, even though they're part of the overall Davidic dynasty, right? This name shows up again in Matthew chapter 1. In the genealogy of Jesus, Joseph is actually from Jeconiah's family tree. Which means that if Joseph had been Jesus' biological dad, Jesus could not be the king of Israel.
Nice. Yeah.
Because of this curse way back in...
It's a little tidbit you wouldn't pick up on your own.
All the way back here in Jeremiah 22.
That's awesome.
So that doesn't mean that David's dynasty was gone, obviously, because he had more sons than just this one little narrow tree, and even Solomon had more sons than just this one little narrow tree.
Right.
So it's not like David's whole dynasty. God is still going to fulfill his covenant with David, but not through this one particular guy, which then shows
a branch, right? So that branch would be done.
Right. But the connection to Jesus in Matthew 1 is amazing.
Yeah.
Tucked back in here at the end of chapter 22.
Okay, so now we get into chapter 23, and God talks about all these former kings that have been over Israel and how they're all going to be judged.
Yeah.
And that he's going to provide a better king.
And not even just kings, but if you were to read the beginning of chapter 23, sort of alongside Ezekiel 34, he uses the concept of false shepherds, which includes priests and prophets. So all leaders of Israel have been leading them away from God instead of toward God. But the king aspect is more prominent here, but that's not the whole picture. Yeah.
So we take this being the future state, end times, future state, Messiah is going to be what God actually intended.
Yeah, verse 5, I'll raise up for them a righteous branch, a descendant of David. That whole concept of righteous branch is definitely messianic. The name in verse 6, the Lord provide us with justice, Yovet Sekenu, that is messianic, the whole thing. He's talking about when he plants them back in their land. That's still future. That's all kingdom related stuff.
He also says at that time the false prophets will be taken care of. So,
and we see that prophesied again in the book of Zechariah. Okay. The false prophets will not be in Messiah's kingdom. What I did find what's really interesting, like in verse 13 here, God says, I saw the prophets of Samaria doing something that was disgusting. They prophesied in the name of the god Baal and led my people Israel astray. Then verse 14, I see the prophets of Jerusalem doing something just as shocking. Samaria was the capital of Israel, the northern kingdom.
Right.
And 100 years ago, they were taken into captivity. And so now Judah is doing the same thing. So there's this nod back to, you guys are doing the same thing that Israel was taken captive for. Why wouldn't I do this?
Why would I have learned it? Yeah, the same thing.
Why didn't you learn, number one, and why would you expect me to be anything, to do anything different for you when you're doing the same thing that Israel did?
Right.
Yep. Now, we're not going all the way through chapter 23. We're gonna pick up a little bit.
Yeah, we end
time.
verse 24.
Yeah. I really like
verse 25.
No, there's this really neat reference here in verses 18 and 22 about God's inner circle.
Okay, well, let's hear it.
It just says, he says, you think you know everything, but when did you stand in my inner circle? Do you really know what's going on in this world? Do you really know what I'm thinking? Or are you just making stuff up? And I love the concept that God has an inner circle.
Right.
And I think there's stuff throughout the Bible that helps talk about that.
So I immediately go to Job.
Mm-hmm.
You know, where were you when I built the foundation?
Yep.
And then I also
the sons of God who presented themselves. Right. Yep.
Right. And then I also go to Jesus having, quote, an inner circle.
Yeah.
Right. Even though he had all these disciples and he had 12 that were definitely close, there was 3 that were even closer.
Yep. And then we get into the book of Daniel that talks about the angelic watchers, or these sentinels that overlook the earth. And you bring that into some of the what we call pseudepigraphal writings, sort of like the book of Jubilees, the book of Enoch, that talks about how angels interact with the earth. And I just think it's really interesting that even Jeremiah has this little nod to the way God works in this world through agents.
It's cool to think that we don't know everything.
And we absolutely don't know everything. Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
Right. Well, good. I think that's a good place to end today.
Can I ask one more? Can I bring one more?
Yeah.
One more.
Obviously,
out?
yeah.
Because in verses 20, there's a lot of stuff in verse 23. God almost is like you can almost hear him erupting, right? So my dad was loud when I was a kid, right? And sometimes, if he gets angry, and if I get angry, you just sort of overflow, right? Verse 23. Do you people think that I am some local deity? He's just like, verse 24, don't you know that I'm everywhere? It's like, you people don't even have a clue what you're talking about.
Yeah, go back to being a little kid, right? Where your world is your house and that's it.
Yep. Yep. And the false religions, every little god had their little place. On land, on water, I'm the god of fertility, I'm the god of wheat, I'm the god of whatever. And you have the true living God is like, you're treating me like one of these other guys. Right. Is that really what you think I am? And just as I was reading that, it just
how small do you think I am?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. I'm not honoring him for who he really is. Yeah. Right. Lots and lots of stuff in here. We could keep going, and probably too long as it is. But enjoy the reading this time. Enjoy the pushback that Jeremiah gives to God, and yet comes back out of it with the right attitude of praise and recognizing God for who he really is. If you have questions or comments, we'd love to hear those. Otherwise, we'll pick up here in the middle of chapter 23 next time.
Bye, everybody.